Okay, welcome back everybody. In this video, what I want to do is go into a little more detail about the stages of photosynthesis. In a previous video, I talked about just what the chemical reaction of photosynthesis is, where it happens, how plants and other photosynthetic organisms take in light energy, carbon dioxide, and water into the chloroplasts in their cells, and they use that to produce sugars, carbohydrates, and oxygen. And so when we look at this in a little more detail, photosynthesis really happens in two basic stages. We have what we call the light-dependent reactions. Over on this side of the image here is our light-dependent. They require light to happen, that's why they call it that. And then over here we have our light-independent reactions. And that's also called, it's referred to as the Calvin cycle. It was discovered by a gentleman by the name of Melvin Calvin, and so when you discover something important, they tend to name it after you. So we call this the Calvin cycle here. I personally like to break the light-dependent reactions into two other parts: absorption of light energy and then conversion of light energy. It helps me make sense of it all and just organize it in my brain. And so I'll try and explain this for you guys. In a real quick overview before we delve into it in more detail. The light comes in to the chloroplasts. It's the energy from the light in the form of photons is absorbed by the pigments in the chloroplast, the chlorophyll. The plants take in water, and from that, that is used to produce these high energy molecules, ATP and NADPH here. Oxygen is also released from this process, and these molecules here then are where the light energy is converted into a form that can then be used over here in the Calvin cycle. And that Calvin cycle then takes the energy from the ATP and NADPH, uses that through a complex series of reactions to produce organic molecules from carbon dioxide. And so let's go into a little more detail about how each one of these things happens. When we look at the structure of a chloroplast here, the light-dependent reactions and the light absorption and the conversion of light energy here is really going to happen inside these thylakoids. And a lot of it is happening across the thylakoid membrane. And so the chlorophyll, the pigment that absorbs this light energy, is found in the thylakoids. That's why they're green, and that's why we see the green in the leaves and the stems of plants. So let's look at these membranes in a little more detail here. Now, when you look at this, you say, Randolph, really, I've got to know all of that. Well, in this video, no, you don't. What I want to do is take this really complicated image here and break it down, and so to help make a little more sense of it. So when we look at this, the first thing that I see is that this membrane looks a whole lot like when we learned about the cell membrane. We've got our phospholipid bilayer here, the hydrophilic heads that are on the outsides and the hydrophobic tails here. We've got a series of proteins that are going across the membranes, and each one of these proteins and groups of proteins is doing a specific job. So really, when we break this down, the thylakoid membrane is very similar to the cell membrane. It's got the phospholipid bilayer and then proteins that carry out specific functions. And those proteins that are in that bilayer, really, the jobs that they do is what determines the role of these thylakoids. So let's actually take this and break it down a little bit further. I want to cut this apart a little bit and show you what's happening. So the first part, this very first step here, is light absorption. So this is when the sunlight, the energy in the photons is absorbed by chlorophyll. And it happens in this complex here that we refer to as photosystem 2. That's why it says PS2 here. The photosystem 2, it's called that even though it's the first step in this whole series of actions. It was discovered second, and so that's why they call it that. But really the basic idea is the light energy comes in here and it excites chlorophyll. It's giving chlorophyll that pigment some energy. And that energy then is used by an enzyme in this little complex here to break apart water. It's splitting apart the hydrogens and the oxygens here in this water molecule. Now, if we can do that twice, I'm going to end up with 4 hydrogen ions that come over here at the end of this little series of reactions. And if I did that again to 2 water molecules, I'm going to end up with O2. So if we take a look at our chemical equation for photosynthesis here, light energy plus carbon dioxide plus water is going to yield or give us sugars and oxygen. Well, in this very first step, the light energy is coming in, we're using the light energy, and the water is being used. And so we're taking care of 2 of these parts over here on the reactant side of the equation, and we're producing the oxygen for the products here. And that all happens in that light absorption stage. So sunlight comes in, excites the chlorophyll, provides the energy for this enzyme to split water. Now, as that happens, the second part of the light-dependent reactions begins, and that's what we call the electron transport chain. So we have, again, this kind of complex series of steps that happens throughout this membrane, but really what I want to do is follow the blue line. The blue line here is showing us the movement of these electrons. So as water is split, as the proteins and the enzymes in the photosystem 1 get excited, it releases electrons. And these electrons are very high energy electrons, and so the energy that those electrons has is used to help these proteins here do their job. I'm not going to go into much detail about what they do here. We'll go into that in a later video, but really for this one, what I want you to know is that the energy that these electrons have is moving down this series of proteins here, and it's allowing things to happen. Primarily, what it's doing is moving these hydrogen ions that are outside the thylakoids, and through active transport is moving these hydrogen ions in. And it is active transport because really, as we split water, the hydrogen ions are building up inside the thylakoids, inside what we call the thylakoid lumen, that space in the thylakoids. So we have a high concentration of positively charged hydrogen ions in here, and a lower concentration out here. Well, to move molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration, it's going to require energy. It's active transport. And so that's where these electrons, the energy from these electrons helps. It does that. And then as we get over here to what we see as PS1, this is photosystem 1, the light energy is also being absorbed by this clump here. There's chlorophyll in that as well. And so again, there's some enzymes and some proteins in here that take that light energy, and what they're doing with that light energy is re-exciting, re-energizing these electrons and providing more energy for photosystem 1 here. Looks like, oh, this is re-energizing the electrons from photosystem 2. Sorry, that's what I had typed down here. And it's using that actually to take this molecule called NADP, and which is positively charged. It's going to add the electron and the hydrogen ion here, and it's going to create NADPH. This molecule here, what you need to know about that really is that it's a high energy molecule. That is the first molecule here that we're going to talk about that is produced from the energy from the sun, from that light energy. And that's going to go into the Calvin cycle later on. So the electrons are used to power this series of reactions here that create NADPH from NADP and hydrogen. The other thing that's happening in the electron transport chain, as these hydrogen ions build up inside the thylakoid lumen, as we create this concentration gradient of hydrogen ions in there, they want to move back across the membrane. They want to diffuse across that membrane. And so it's creating really this concentration gradient that has energy in it. And so the hydrogen ions build up in this area. If we look at the bigger picture here, we can see the hydrogen ions building up. And what they want to do is they want to move across, and there's a protein here that's attached to an ATP synthase enzyme. And what happens is as these hydrogen ions move across, they're providing energy to power this ATP synthase enzyme. And what that does is it synthesizes ATP. The basic view of this is as these move across, they provide energy for this enzyme to take ADP and a phosphate, add those together, and create this ATP molecule, which again is a high energy molecule. If you watch the video that I made about ATP, we talked about that as being the energy currency of the cell. It's the molecule that cells primarily use for energy to get their work done. And so the electron transport chain then is producing these two high energy molecules, NADPH and ATP. So that's that conversion of light energy. And then that goes to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the second stage, the light independent reactions. At this point, we don't need the light anymore because we have the energy molecules, the ATP and the NADPH. And the Calvin cycle is going to happen here in the stroma outside the thylakoids. And so the thylakoids and the proteins and enzymes in the membranes of the thylakoids have really done the first part of the job of photosynthesis. They took in the light and they've converted it. Now what's going to happen in the Calvin cycle is going to use carbon dioxide here, and the energy that was produced in the ATP and NADPH there, and it's going to use that to create organic molecules, which eventually are used to make sugars. And so I'm going to show you this image here, which is really looks incredibly complex, and actually the Calvin cycle is a complex series of reactions. I don't want to go into those reactions right now. What I want you to understand from this is that the Calvin cycle is this series of reactions that take carbon dioxide in. So carbon dioxide is coming in. It uses the energy that was converted into ATP and NADPH in the light-dependent reactions here. It uses that energy to take carbon dioxide and use the carbons and oxygens there to create these organic molecules. And through one cycle of this, it's going to basically make half of a glucose molecule. After this goes through the cycle twice, we can then use the organic molecules that are produced to create glucose and other carbohydrates, or plants do. We don't, but plants will take that. And so the Calvin cycle, again, is this really complex series of reactions that are happening here. But what's going on is carbon dioxide is coming in. It's taking the CO2 and rearranging that with the hydrogen ions or hydrogen atoms that it has as well, and it's producing these organic molecules that eventually become the sugars that we get from plants, the food that we get from plants. Here's a quick overview of the whole series of reactions. And so at the top here we have our chemical equation for photosynthesis. Light energy plus 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. Really, in short, light energy plus carbon dioxide plus water is going to produce sugars and oxygen, or glucose and oxygen. And so this breaks down what is used and produced in each stage of photosynthesis. I don't want to read it all to you, but I'll highlight the big ones here. In our light-dependent reactions, as far as the chemical equation is concerned, that's where light energy and water are used and oxygen is produced. And through those series of steps and reactions there, it's creating these high energy molecules, NADPH and ATP. Those are used down here along with the carbon dioxide from our chemical equation for photosynthesis to produce this glucose molecule that we then use for energy. So that right there is a brief overview of the stages of photosynthesis. And again, in later videos, I'll go into that in more detail.